Right, everybody, it's 11 o'clock. So I am going to take the great pleasure of introducing our next keynote. So you've just heard myself chatting with Debs and Debbie. So the first person who's going to speak to you is Debs Robinson. I think many of you will know Debs. She gave the keynote at the first OASN conference in 2019. She quite possibly taught many of you here today if you trained as a teacher at the university, or maybe you've got associations with Nottingham Trent or Nottingham University, where Debs has worked as well. If you do know Debs, you'll probably have heard her very colourful description of herself. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Debs, the academic. Debs' research is focused on inclusion and special educational needs. She has a deep understanding of policy and practice and how these two come together. She has worked closely with both the English and Irish departments for education, conducting impactful research into education healthcare plans and inclusion in the early years, which is the work she's currently doing in Ireland. She is also the lead researcher for the OASN Peer Challenge, which you were hearing Kath Mitchell thank her for early on, and which you also will have engaged in. And that's what makes this so important, because Debs is telling us about work that you've been doing. She has spoken and written widely on the topic of ecologies for inclusion and is known internationally and nationally for being an articulate and highly engaging presenter. I first came across Debs' work when I read her book, Inclusive Practice in the Primary School. Her work stood out from all the other texts I had because of the way it was written so concisely and analysed and explained ideas that I've been thinking about but just hadn't found a good way to pull together coherently and think through the detail. It's Debs' outstanding ability to make meaning from evidence, make meaning from research data that Derby City schools have taken the time to contribute to and engage in, that means I know the next 45 minutes will be both highly informative and relevant to your school's future developments. As well as engaging, and Debs knowing Debs, she'll probably throw in a joke or two. So it gives me the greatest pleasure to hand over to my colleague and friend, Professor Debs Robinson.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Jerry. It's unusual to feel so good about yourself on a Monday morning, so thank you for making me feel that. I really appreciate it. Really appreciate it. I've been looking forward to doing this keynote for a long time, literally for years, because the pandemic has kept us apart until now. So thank you so much for being here and giving me the opportunity to share with you some of the nuggets of knowledge that we've seen emerging in our data about the expertise in the city. And thank you, Jerry, for that introduction. So you can tell from Jerry's lovely bio of me, and she only really focused on the good bits, but you can tell from the bio that I've been around a long time, and also SEND and inclusion has been a continuing focus of my work as an educator. And I think I'd claim that happened from the beginning of my career on my first day as an NQT. And it wasn't diminished when my own two children were identified as having special needs. One of my children has autism and the other one has severe dyslexia. So it's always been an important part of my life as a mother and also as an educator. So earlier, Kath Mitchell was really kind, and she was kind enough to thank me personally for my commitment to the city. And I do have that commitment, but I also think it's crucially important to say that it's been Dr. Jerry Codina who's been the key person from the university, who's been energetically steering the Derby SEND OA work. And she's really put the hours in a passionate and capable way, along with Pip Betts, who's our project officer, who we could not have survived without. And Jerry, of course, would be the first to say that this is a collaboration with so many committed expert partners from the city. And I'm just going to name a few, not all, but just a few. Of course, Debbie Gehring, Alistair Crawford, Joe Ward, Paula Nightingale, Sally Gladwin, Leah Copestake, and in the earlier days of the project, Pete Chilvers, Ian Peel, Clive Lawrence, and many, many more. And of course, all of the challengers and the SENCOs and the SLT, the senior leadership teams in schools that have worked with the project. So we just want to say thank you to everyone involved. And in our final report about the research findings from the project, we'll celebrate everyone who was involved, because this project would not have succeeded without any of you. And I think this theme of mutual dependency and collaboration is going to be a really important one for my talk today. And I thank Andre Imich for sharing what is an influencing national context for SEND provision. And kind of what I read from his talk was that there's going to be more focus on that group of children and young people who were described by the term SEND support. And this kind of provides a perfect segue for what will be an unashamed focus on Derby, on the city of Derby and its SEND provision in mainstream schools, because there's a lot of knowledge there that I want to share with you, and a lot of things that I want to celebrate, and these things have come from the data in the research project that we've done. So without further ado, let's have a look at what we're going to cover in this talk today. So firstly, I'm going to talk about the OA funded SEND Peer Challenge programme. That's been the focus of the research that we've been doing in the University of Derby. And I'm going to talk about, for those members of the audience who don't know about it, I'm going to talk about what it involved and what its principles are. And this is to be inclusive of everyone. And it will be important to focus on its principles because there are links between the principles of the OA project on SEND and other larger scale localised projects of school improvement for SEND, and I kind of want to draw out some of those points of similarity. I'll also share some data and findings relevant to understanding how SENCOs and challengers experience the SEND Peer Challenge, and I'll illustrate how our data actually gives us an insight into the most prevalent strengths and areas of development in Derby schools at the time that the SEND Peer Challenge programme was taking place. So we also saw in the data something really interesting, and it was Derby City's leaders' collective theory on how to improve schools for SEND and inclusion quickly and effectively. It's particularly relevant in our continuing and hopefully soon to be post-COVID world, because we know that pupils with SEND faced particular challenges, and we want these pupils to be supported in the best way we can as part of an equitable programme of recovery. And what I'm going to suggest in this talk is that what we saw in the data was a blueprint formed by Derby City's leaders themselves on how we can keep moving forward so that our schools are recovering and improving with that group of learners in mind. So let's start by looking at the question shown in the yellow box, which is, what was the SEND Peer Challenge and what were its key principles? So the first point to make about the SEND Peer Challenge programme was that it was part of a wider programme of OA funded activity on SEND under the heading of the OA Whole School SEND and Inclusion Project, and this was developed by the OA SEND Strategy Working Group, who you can see mentioned here on the slide, and this was in collaboration with Derby's Secondary Strategy Group and Derby's Primary Strategy Group, members of Derby City Council and the University of Derby. So it was a big collaborative partnership. And it also engaged, of course, in its actions, Derby City school leaders and Derby school SENCOs, and some of these people, these important professionals, received SEN peer challenges. And there was also a project management group that were in charge of oversight and steering, and those involved lots of people, representatives from the groups you see there. So you can see that collaboration and partnership are very important principles to note in the way that this project was run. And these are important principles to note because they have relevance, as we'll see later. So now let's look at what happens in a peer SEND challenge for an individual school. And again, this is for people who don't know much about this or weren't involved. So this is the process that was involved in a SEND peer challenge for an individual school. So you can see that each school would complete a SEND and inclusion self-evaluation framework based on a given template, and the lead challenger in the challenger team that were going to go in and work with the school, the peer challengers, would receive the evaluation and some school level data from Derby City Council, and along with other members of the challenger team that were working on the peer challenge for the school, the team challenger would do some further preparatory research. The purpose of this was to make sure that the challenge was bespoke to the needs of the school. And then the challenger team would liaise with the school, with the SENCO and with the senior leadership team to design a 1-day for primary and 2-day for secondary school visits, and these included lots of different types of evidence gathering, like meeting parents of children with special needs, meeting pupils, looking at documents within the school, observing teaching, and it was all bespoke to the individual school. And in later stages, this was sometimes done virtually if that was felt to be a more doable way of making things happen. So the schedule was bespoke to each school, and that was all to make sure that it was meaningful and relevant. And the final result of the challenger process was a report on the outcomes that listed strengths, areas to develop, and recommended first actions. And then the challenger team, the lead challenger, would follow this up with visits to the school to support them in implementing the recommendations, all in the spirit of peer challenge and support. And it's important to say as well that there are a couple of principles underpinning this. The first was that the process had to be the right balance of challenge and support. That was a key principle because it was believed to be the essence of a successful process. And the other one was that challenger teams were formed of expert practitioners in SEND, and the project management board made selections from applications based on that principle. So let's talk a little bit more about principles, because I've mentioned to you that this is important learning for us in the city. So the programme, of course, was school-led, as the whole OA modus was. And this is because we know, as we see later, that when the task of improvement is owned by schools themselves, change can be quicker and more sustainable. And it's also, let's face it, it's also where the knowledge is, in the expertise and innovation of practitioners themselves. So the project principles were also based on the spirit of partnership. And this is because what we recognise is that our schools are asset rich in terms of knowledge. Our region is asset rich. And what we need to do is we need to move the expert knowledge of all the people in this region around such that improvement can take place. And of course, in this particular project, we brought in the knowledge of practitioners in the LA and also the university into the mix to enrich that knowledge base. Also to say that the work was focused on equity, because the SEND Peer Challenge sought to centralise SEND in the minds and actions of school leaders and centralise it in the activities that they were doing on school improvement in their schools, something that Andre referred to earlier. And finally, and again, the reasons why I'm mentioning these things will become clear in a moment. And finally, the programme was coordinated by a single organisation, and in this case it was the University of Derby who took the project management role, but worked with the project management board, which included a range of partners, as you saw on one of the previous slides. Now, this is not the first time that such principles have come together in local area projects of school improvement focused on equity. And I'll give you two examples now that are relevant to understanding this project in the context of what we know about effective approaches to localised school improvement. So, of course, the first I'm going to talk about is one you've probably heard about, and it's a project called London Challenge. So this was a DFE funded regional project of school improvement that involved partnership between schools, the local authority, a university and a coordinating group. So some of those principles we saw earlier, it was about school to school peer support, and it was about an appreciative approach rather than a stigmatising one. And it began to emerge, actually, that schools in London were improving much faster than schools in other parts of the country. And the London challenge was identified by researchers as one of the key reasons for that. And key learning was that when ownership shifted to schools themselves, change was more impactful and sustainable. And also it was the idea that school improvement happens when we understand the existing assets in the system, as Kidson and Norris noted, and then move that knowledge around to create a rich shared knowledge base. Now, what we'll do now is we'll move further up north, and we'll move into Manchester. But first, to note that the effect of this project was called the London effect. This is a term I want to come back to later. So in Greater Manchester, we had the Greater Manchester Challenge, and this was similar in method to the London Challenge, and it was funded by the DFE, and it was about peer-to-peer support, it was about partnership and collaboration, and it also had a lead coordinating steering group to pull the activity together. So this was about reducing polarisation and creating more of a peer appreciative approach rather than an accusative one. Now, returning to Derby then, we can see that the same principles were at work. It's about moving around the assets in our city and our region such that school improvement is fast and it's sustainable. So all of these ideas were part of the project in which the Send Peer Challenge programme happened. So returning to Derby as well, let's have a look at how many schools were engaged in the Send Peer Challenge. How many schools received and experienced a Send Peer Challenge? Well, it was 48 primary schools and 15 secondary schools, and this was all under the shadow of COVID, of course. So in many ways, it's not my pleasure to do this, but I do think it's important to say well done and congratulations and thank you to everyone for making this happen, because it's a symbol of resilience and commitment from our colleagues in the city. So now we've seen how the design principles of the Send Peer Challenge worked and how many schools were involved. It's time to look at some of our research findings and consider what we know from the research and the data about how the Peer Challenge programme was experienced by SENCOs, by senior leaders and by challengers who were involved in the process. So generally, SENCOs experienced the Send Peer Challenge process to be positive, and that was in the large majority of cases. So SENCOs did say that they often felt nervous in anticipation of the challenge, but then when it was happening, they experienced it as critical friendship. So SENCOs also reported that the self-evaluation processes that the school had to do before the challenge was positive and had positive effects. For example, it focused the senior leadership team on a structured self-evaluation of their provision, and that was helpful in forming a clear picture of their strengths, their areas for development and their next steps. And SENCOs talked about how this was a good preparation for the challenge process. It helped make it more meaningful and focused. So there I'd just like to thank my colleagues Dr. Hannah Blake and Dr. Jill Hanson for collecting this valuable data. So in terms of, we also saw that they perceived that awareness had been raised, SLT, and that SEND had become a focus for the school and had centred everybody's attention on it. And this was one of the purposes of the project. So it's good that that happened for SENCOs. And challengers found that schools were really open and genuinely curious to find out how they were doing from the perspective of a peer. And this seems to have been an important feature of the project, and perhaps another sign that it was appreciative rather than accusative. And a couple of issues that came up were that challenges worked best when they were the right level of support and challenge, so pitching that right was key, and it seemed to have been the case for the vast majority of challenges. And also that the peer challengers had to have the right level of expertise in order to support the school, and that was the case in the vast majority of challenges. Now, if we just go back to this slide, and the idea that actually the peer challenge process made SEND provision a focus. This seems particularly important in the current context because we want SEND to continue to have high profile, and it's essential that it does this in the context of a continuing post-COVID recovery context. So what we'll do now is we'll move on to how some of our data and findings are relevant to that future focus, to that next step focus, which is our post-COVID recovery and equitable school improvement within post-COVID recovery. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a look at what we learned about prevalent strengths and areas for development in schools first, and then we're going to move on to the blueprint that Derby City leaders have given us for how to move forward quickly and efficiently and effectively with school improvement for SEND. So in terms of our approach to analysing data, we use traditional methods of qualitative analysis, which involves a long-winded, intense process of coding, categorising and thematising. And we also used a coding agenda in the context of qualitative content analysis so that we could add up how often particular codes, categories and themes came up across all 46 school reports. So the focus of our data analysis was the content of the school reports. And so we use this analysis to test for prevalence so that we can make statements about the ideas, the themes, the theories that were most important in Derby City's leaders' messages to each other about how best to improve SEND provision in schools. So here you see an example of a redacted report, and what we did was we quite painstakingly analysed all of the reports, 46 reports, to identify code and categorise and thematise the content of those reports. For example, one of those was around monitoring systems and tracking. And I'd like to thank my colleagues Dr. Eleni Dimitriou and Sarwat Qureshi for their tireless work on this process. Okay, so what was the balance of strengths and areas developed in the text we analysed, which were those 46 school reports? Well, what we found was that 1,712 units of meaning were coded as strengths in the school's practice in those reports, and 711 were coded as areas for development. And what this indicates is that, in fact, the process was appreciative, and also there's a lot to celebrate. There are a lot of assets in our schools, good practices in our schools that we can build on. Now, when we look in more detail at the prevalence of particular categories and themes in the text content coded as strength, what do we find? Well, I shall reveal this slowly in order to keep you all engaged. So these are the most prevalent areas, these are the most prevalent categories and themes that came up as strengths in those 46 school reports. So partnership with parents and pupils, parents being satisfied and pupils being satisfied with provision in school and their experience of inclusion. You can see for those there are a high number of references, so we counted up how often that theme came up in areas of strength. Next one is quality of teaching and learning, and schools were praised by challengers for their individualised and appropriate support and their systematic identification of barriers to learning. Of course, it was different for each school, but these are the most prevalent themes across the challenges. It was also noted in the reports very often that the schools had high quality teaching and that was across the school. And you can see that there was actually 65 references to this as strengths in the reports. Leadership was praised in terms of the commitment of the leadership team to inclusive whole school approaches and awareness of SEND in the SLT. In terms of outcomes, schools were praised when challengers saw positive academic attainment for children and young people with SEND. And another theme that came up often was schools being praised for effective and rigorous monitoring and tracking systems, such that barriers to learning were identified. So I'm just going to go on to show you these themes, and I'll just hover on that for a moment so you can have a review yourself. Not all schools had these listed as strengths, but they were just prevalent strengths across the data set. And here are those with at least 30 references. Just pausing on that for you for a moment. Now it's important to turn to the question, what areas for development were the most prevalent across the 46 schools? The reports for the 46 schools, and this is what we found in our content analysis of those reports. So coming up as well as an area for development in schools, of course this would be different schools, partnership with pupils and parents, and schools were asked to develop collaboration between the school and parents. Quality teaching and learning, schools were asked particularly to develop the teaching and learning for all in terms of quality first teaching. And there was also this focus in the reports, there was a prevalent focus in the reports on improving the quality of provision within the classrooms themselves. Of course, these are different schools. Leadership, school leaders were frequently asked to improve the rigour and the doability of their school SEND development plan. And in terms of outcome, it was about a more strategic approach to closing the SEND attainment gap. And for monitoring, tracking and evaluation, it was about developing more effective, rigorous and monitoring systems so that unmet needs could be identified and the impacts of interventions could be understood. Now, I'm pausing for a moment because you will notice that there's a similarity between the most prevalent areas praised and the most prevalent areas raised as areas of development. And what we began to see in the data was a living theory among leaders who were working together to improve schools, a living theory about what would work best in improving schools for SEND and inclusion. So schools were praised for implementing these practices, and schools were asked to implement these same practices to develop. And in many ways that represents a theory about what works best. So having considered that, here are the areas for development, which I'll hover over for a moment for you, just to give you a bit of time to think. And there are references that were counted to occur at least 10 times in the data set. So what I'd like to do now is move on to a connecting message about the future. Because what we saw in the data was Derby City leaders giving us a blueprint for action in a period of recovery that may well be relevant to us in the years ahead. So following a process of further thematic reduction with enumeration and all sorts of latent thematic analysis, we were able to identify the following predominant messages from Derby City leaders to other Derby City leaders about how best to improve schools for SEND and inclusion. And there are 6 of these, so let's have a look at them. Okay, so first of all was a message about distributing responsibility and accountability across all teaching staff in a context where there was also partnership with pupils and parents. So this is a message about distributive leadership, and this is something that workshop 2 later on in the day will be focusing on. The second was about the importance of shared vision and mission and the translation of this into a doable school improvement plan, and workshop 1 will focus on this vision and mission side of inclusion. Number 3 was about instructional leadership. It was about the important role that SLT, including now SENCOs, have for leading learning and leading the teaching staff in developing quality first teaching and interventions. The 4th was about the importance of robust assessment and monitoring, such that there was a reduced chance of needs going under the radar, of unmet needs not being noticed, or that interventions were a waste of resource. The 5th was a clear message from leaders to leaders about kind of getting the house in order, so that, for example, the SLT have SEND as a job remit. All members of SLT, including subject leaders, have SEND as a remit within their work. That the SENCO is a present and powerful member of the SLT, and that systems such as SEND information sharing are working efficiently so that staff can take up the responsibility that was distributed to them in point 1. And the final message was about leaders' role in planning and providing high quality CPD, including sometimes covering the basics of SEND where that was needed. So let me just click so you can see the last one too. So those were the 6 latent messages that emerged from our analysis of this whole data set. And I'm just going to, in fact, I'll do that again because that was quite clever, wasn't it? I'm quite proud of this. So I'm just going to turn this into a blueprint. There you go, for the city. Potentially, it could be one. Now, of course, another question we were curious about was how influential had the self-evaluation template been on the things that Derby City Challengers had written. And don't forget, they wrote those in collaboration with the schools that they challenged, and they were based on the things that collectively the school and the challengers had chosen to focus on. And you can see that one of the big themes in the self-evaluation template is schools have to ask themselves, does the school have a clear vision for the inclusive education of all pupils with SEND in the school? And that was one of the key latent messages that came up from the data. So we thought, well, let's find out how influential the template was, because it'd be interesting to see what's particularly bespoke and unique about the message that Derby's leaders are giving to other leaders in Derby. So we used content analysis to come up with prevalence illustration of what was happening in these reports. So you can see the yellow boxes are what was written in the school reports, and the grey boxes are text that was in the self-evaluation template. So we could work out what the difference was between them, because we wanted to know, were Derby City leaders emphasising some things more than they were emphasised in the template. So just to pick out a few interesting differences and similarities. So you can see that, for example, in the case of message 6, there's only a very small difference in the proportion of text coded to that theme in Derby's SEND Challenge school reports and the proportion of text coded to that theme in the school evaluation template. Now, we can't test whether these differences are statistically significant, but we can just look at the differences as a point of interest. So, for example, here was one of the big differences. In the reports, Derby City leaders were placing emphasis on this important theme, but less emphasis than there was in the evaluation template. This was also the case in terms of whole school leadership. So there was less emphasis on that. And there was much more emphasis on this sorting out management. So sorting out the management and operation of SEND provision in the school. So you can see that it's kind of 3 times more prevalent in the school reports than it was in the evaluation template. Now, this does not mean that Derby City leaders were just focusing on this operational system stuff. It was in the context of these important other messages. All of it's important, but it's just interesting to see that that's where Derby City leaders felt the work needed to be done. So we could interpret this in this way. The message from Derby City's leaders to other leaders in the city is that essentially in a context of transformative, i.e. mission-based, value-based leadership, and instructional leadership, i.e. leadership focused on the collaborative development of best practice, it's important to get the management right and the systems right and get the house in order so that SEND provision can run smoothly and effectively in a way that allows everyone to take responsibility for SEND. So having said that, there's some interesting things we as researchers would like to note. And it's that this could be a blueprint for equitable recovery with SEND in focus in our continuing post-COVID world. And what we have tried to do today and in our research work so far is to crystallise the theories held by Derby City leaders at this point in time, such that they have the potential to become our collective memory about what the city knows. And the aim has been to crystallise this knowledge asset in such a way that it's available as we move forward in implementing the Derby Graduated Response Project, something that builds on all of these elements and is led by, of course, our wonderful teaching schools, St Giles and St Martin's. And here are our final points. So personally, I'd like to note that the university continues to work in partnership with the city. So, for example, we're working with Paula Nightingale and Wyndham Research School to establish a Derby Senko research cooperative to continue to foreground peer-to-peer support and collective learning. We believe that Derby's got assets that we'd like to build on and we'd like to broadcast. And wouldn't it be lovely if in the future people talked about Derby in relation to SEND in the same way they talked about the London challenge and the London effect? Wouldn't it be lovely if they started talking about the Derby effect? And we feel that we can support the city in the role of broadcasting the assets that we have here. So I would like to say thank you very much, and perhaps together, building on the collective wisdom of the practice experts we have in this city, people will be talking about us in the future. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Deb, so much. That was so informative. I just noted from one of your slides about the amount of data that you and the team have crunched in total with the strengths and areas for development. That's 2,423 pieces of data, which really gives us in the city a clear steer, research focused as to next steps and what we're doing well, which is really important. A couple of questions have just come in to the chat, so I will glance over to those. Sarah's posted a question about the thematic feedback in post-16 provision and SEND Centres for Excellence by the DFE.
I think is it via the ETF? The
yes,
Education
that's right.
Foundation, yes. Okay, so thanks for that, Sarah. I think we both talked about this, haven't we? The Centres of Excellence, and it's really interesting that the same themes come up where leaders are telling leaders about the things to prioritise, because you've been involved, haven't you, in evaluations of other FE provisions. And I think what we wanted to do was we wanted to connect those themes up and look at what Derby City leaders are prioritising for each other. And it sounds like there's some connections between our work, which we look forward to talking about more in the future.
Fantastic, thank you. And Sarah's just added to that, which I'll come back to in a moment. So Amy was asking about the longer term wider impact on SEND from the pandemic. and how might we be overcoming that. Peer review is a part of that. Become a regular cycle to continue move forward with SEND provision.
Amy, you're brilliant. Because one of the things that's becoming clear is peer-to-peer review is a really powerful mode of supporting school improvement at the local level. And what we need is, exactly as you say, continued focus on SEND. And one of the things that we've wanted to broadcast really in this talk today is that's worth funding and it's worth supporting because it has impact. And we also wanted to kind of lay down the foundation of the knowledge asset we have in the city so that peer review process can continue. So we will be writing a lot about this in the future, and we're hoping that government agencies, charities and other sources of grant funding might also see this as something that is valuable to support in the future, because our learnings from Derby are that it's powerful, and learnings from other larger scale, I mean bigger projects, localized projects, are also key. So I think it's worth mentioning, isn't it, that the Greater Manchester Challenge got £50 million worth of funding. The London Challenge got millions and millions of pounds of funding in a context of billions that were spent on the national strategies. Now, in Derby, we're a smaller locality, and it was under £500,000 for our Send Peer Challenge project. But nonetheless, it's an important thing to continue to. It's an important thing to continue to use and resource as a way of making sure that SEND is on our mind as continually as possible in this post-pandemic, well, continuous at the moment, post-pandemic world. So thank you so much for that, Amy.
Well, that brings us to the end of those questions. I have a few moments left, so I might just ask you one of my own, Debs, perhaps a similar question to the one I asked Andre. But in relation to Derby, what would excite you most about trajectories for where Derby's going with SEND and coming out from this project? And where would you like to see things in a couple of years?
Okay, so thank you for that question, Jerry. Okay, so I mean, there's a lot for us still to do in the city of Derby. We all know that. But what we have is we have a foundation of knowledge that we can build in. What I would love in 2 years, and I have to tell you, this stuff is starting to happen already. What I would like to happen in a couple of years is that people will come to Derby City to see how it is done. That's what I would like. Now, of course, it's really important for every regional project to be bespoke to that region. And there are things that have worked in Derby that might not work elsewhere, but it's the principles of our work and the knowledge assets of our work that could be of value, so that this city becomes a centre of excellence for school improvement, for SEND and inclusion. That would be fantastic. And one of the reasons why I've talked about what I've talked about today is that I don't want us to lose the potential profit, I mean that in a general way, not money, but to be gained from crystallising our shared knowledge on this issue.
Thank you so much, Debs. And I think that really echoes what Andre was saying and directions forward, and really shows that all this work that we've been putting in is really making a difference in our city. I've just been alerted to a message in the chat from Alistair, who echoes everything that we've just been saying. Thanks, Debs. A brilliant reflective session. Echo the points, RE, energy and resilience of all schools taking part in this project with the backdrop of a global pandemic. So yeah, let's not forget, 1, this conference should have been happening last year. 2, we have continued on with the project. 50% of the data has been gathered in the second year. That's 50% of your schools still engaging in this, challengers, schools and everybody. So it's just really exciting. It's wonderful to have you present here, and it's wonderful to be able to share this with you, because this is our city. And those of you that are coming from further afield, to be able to share the work that we've been doing is a privilege. So thank you ever so much, Debs, for your hard work. Okay, so I'm going to pass on to Debbie Gearing now, who's going to tell you about what's coming up in the opportunity area. As Kath said, it's a project that's been funded for a number of years, but its funding is ongoing. I'm sure Debbie needs no introduction to any of you. She's the head teacher at St Martin's School, and also chair of the Inclusion OA Opportunity Work, which is where some of this is continuing. So over to you, Debbie.
Thank you, Jerry. Good morning, everybody. Great to see you today. What a fantastic conference so far. Really, really interesting. So I'm going to try and share my screen now and pick up on what Jerry's just said about what's happening in the city, where it's going. So some of what Amy's just touched on, we can maybe pick that up as well. So let's see if we can, hopefully you can see my screen now, and it's just starting. We're going to look at the opportunity area work and then the local authority work around SEND, and I'm going to try and update you on both of those aspects of work and try and weave a bit of a line through them, because I know for Senko's particularly there's a lot going on at the moment, and just trying to give a bit of an umbrella so that you can make sense of what's happening. Okay, right, hang on a minute. Right, hopefully that's moved on. So the opportunity area, the SEND work that's been happening over the last 3 years will be drawing to a finish in July. So we were given a year's extension to try and bring the project to meet all the KPIs that were set for it. Really, really impressive response from schools, especially over the last couple of terms. So massive thank you to heads who are on this conference and Senkos who have really carried on supporting and engaging in this work. It has been, you know, it's impressive. Your engagement's really impressive. So the opportunity area, which is a funded programme, will come to an end in July 2021. Schools that are interested to still carry on and have a peer challenge in their school, Joe Ward has said that the local authority can conduct the additional reviews. Charges will be made to cover costs for that, but I know there are several schools where we couldn't tie up getting some challenges into your school because the time frame was just so tight in the end. So if you're still interested, please get in touch with Joe, or you can come via me if you want, and we will look at supporting you with that. You could, you know, from what Debs has just analysed, you can see the power of that process. And I know for all schools that have taken part in the process, it's led to improvement, and that's the point. So it's not too late to get involved. I know Amy's question touched on that just now. It isn't too late to get involved. The whole project was about really trying to develop this community of practice, and that won't just stop when the opportunity area funding finishes. This is a project that was always set up with the community of SEND practitioners at its heart, so that it does have a sustainable future. All of the reviews will be analysed by Debs and her team, which will add to and make even richer the data that they've got already. And that final report, I believe, will be ready in October 2021. So that's the SEND work, which is coming to an end soon. Okay, the SEND work feeds into the inclusion strand of the opportunity area work. So this work has started during the pandemic just this year, and has been really dynamic in terms of how quickly it's got up and running. It's led by Derby County Community Trust, and the focus of the work is inclusion really for the most vulnerable learners in the city. So there are, you can see the work that's going on there. There's the Youth Voice Project, there's some targeted mental health and wellbeing support, more individual and small group work mentoring by Safe and Sound. There's careers employability, so picking up on some of the things that Sarah from the Derby College has alluded to. This does lead into post-16, this work. And the real focus of it post-16 is careers and employability. Derbyshire Education Business Partnership are conducting some research, particularly looking at vulnerable youngsters' journey through the system. So those youngsters that have been excluded at some point on their school career, looking at their journey and see what we can learn from that. And there's also a new referral pathway through social care that's being discussed and pulled together, and that hopefully will be up and running for September. So this, the opportunity area inclusion work's being granted a further year, so it's running into year 5, which will be next year. The youth voice, the mental health and the wellbeing streams will continue. The careers and employability and leading into post-16 will really focus on SEND learners, and the research from Derbyshire Education Business Partnership will also focus specifically in on that group. Because it was coming out from the research so far that it's that group that have got that additional SEND need that are particularly vulnerable. From next year as well, the project will be looking at early intervention for young people at risk of exploitation, and also exploring alternative provision along a behaviour support sort of model. And that new referral pathway, which joins up the services, hopefully will be ready to share in September. So the work will continue, but just be nuanced slightly as we move through and learn almost the children in need of greater targeting, really. Okay, so that's the opportunity area stuff. Okay. And then, so that the opportunity area is running, that's all funded, and then there's the local authority transformation work. I know Pauline's on the call, so she may chip into this afterwards, but I've been working with Paula Paula Nightingale, just to try and pull this together so that you've got a clear understanding of what's happening. So the OA will focus on that inclusion agenda. The LA transformation work is much wider and is much more systems based, with now some real practical projects feeding into to improve outcomes for young people. So it's in response to the written statement of action following the area inspection, and it's really all based in the Derby SEND strategy. Living My Best Life, you'll see, is all over now when you talk to anyone from the council or SEND team, or look at new HCPs, and there's a strategic plan that runs alongside that, and you can look at that. That's on Derby City Council website. So from that work, there are some pilots going on. So these things are the local authority work, not the opportunity area work. So there's Valuing SEND, which is a really in-depth approach to unpicking a child's needs so that you get this rounded picture of them. And there are 4 schools piloting that specific approach. That's running alongside the graduated response pilot, which is targeting a much wider number of schools, 36 schools across the local authority, and that's run by St Martin's and St Giles, working very much in collaboration and partnership with the schools. This is not a challenge project as such. This is coming into the schools so that we can unpick what's happening together and seek to have a look at what the emerging needs are in terms of training for staff, in terms of specialist input for the young people, quality first teaching. So lots of different work through the graduated response, but those 2 projects link up together, and we're piloting them to see what comes out of both, and to see what the most effective way of supporting schools is to get that graduated response correct, really. There's also Derby South, which is a call centre advice line for SENCOs. I'm sure that will be much appreciated by colleagues at the conference today, and there'll also be an equivalent for parents and carers called SEND Navigators. So SEND really hotlines where if you're a SENCO and you've got a particular issue, you can phone up and problem solve that together. I'm sure that will be really, really helpful. The SENCO networks are really well established now. They started with the opportunity area and they've now come into this domain where we're linking everybody up together. The network and CBD calendar for that will be out very soon. Paul is going to confirm that to everybody soon. So please keep attending those networks. They are absolutely crucial to building the partnerships that we've laid the foundations for, and then to establish the sharing of that best practice and also the problem solving together. You know, none of this is easy. We need each other. SEND ambassadors have been appointed, so grateful thanks to them, and they're supporting some of the above ideas. They're SENCOs in the city, and they're a kind of test group for new ideas and pilots and new initiatives. So the SEND ambassadors are now in place as well. Okay, there's also been a capital spend consultation that's been out recently. So the local authority have some money to invest, and they're looking at where to enhance the SEND provision across special schools, ERs and mainstream. So that consultation will inform where the spend goes, and that's critical as well to the strategy. It's really clear, and we all know that it's the mainstream provision that is crucial. You know, what Andre Image said this morning was really interesting, wasn't it? The school impacts the SEND outcomes more, and identifying need more than the actual individual does, and there needs to be a rebalance there. So looking at the provision and where we need to alter and where we need to put the money. Mainstreams are really crucial in that. There's also the iSENCO research cooperative that Debs has just mentioned, convened by Jerry at the University of Derby. So Jerry's planning one meeting per term, which will involve PhD students and looking at the research updates. So any interested SENCOs are always welcome to attend and get involved in that. And Jerry will, I think, be attending the SENCO network so that the university remain involved. It's so important that joining up of everything is crucial to the success of this project. So that's a fantastic that the university is supporting that, and that will really shape future directions, I suspect. So the vision for the local authority is to bring all of the provision in under the umbrella of the local offer. So it's a very complex system to navigate at the minute because it's all over the place, but they're looking, so there is a vision to pull it all under the local offer so that you can go to one place and find all the things that you need in terms of support, from support and partnership type work to the forms that you need to fill in and things like that. So there's a vision to pull that all into line. The opportunity area work is really feeding, I feel, nicely into the graduated response work and the valuing SEND work that the local authority are now running. We need to, it's about deepening our kind of provision, our understanding, I suppose, our shared understanding towards a better systems and better provision is really about us sharing the knowledge that we've got. Deb said it time and time again. It's about moving around the assets that we've got and finding and empowering the excellent practice that we know exists in our city. There is now, I'm fortunate enough to sit around the secondary heads table. I don't know primary heads so well, so apologies, but the secondary heads, there is a real commitment to inclusion that just wasn't there 5 or 6 years ago. So it's an exciting time. We've got heads that want this to happen. We've got SENCOs that are, hugely skilled and hopefully now feel that they've been empowered and valued in a different way through this project. You're so important in it. And together it's about, building trusting relationships. And we've got a fantastic foundation for that now. It's about aiming high, and it's about taking risks within that trust. Hopefully Deb's alluding to the Derby effect. That's something that people will be talking about in 2 or 3 years' time, that we built this community of practice that has got a future, because it's about sharing. It's not about anybody having all the answers. None of us have got that, but it's about investing together in our vulnerable youngsters in the city and really committing to that. The commitment is there from the local authority, from the university, from the DFE. The commitment has been there, and now it's about really realising that and mobilising, building on the foundations that we've laid through the opportunity area, and now that are being taken up really full force and in a really dynamic way with the local authority. That's it from me, Jerry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Debbie. That's really interesting. While you've been, and to see those steps forward, while you've been talking, it's really interesting to see the likes that Amy Jones's question about the regular cycle of the peer review going up. I think that's fantastic. I mean, that just speaks to everything that everybody's been saying this morning. It's how much we have cherished and valued collaborative working, and that's amongst Senkos and the challenge. There's also another very interesting question in relation to the numbers of education healthcare plans increasing in the local authority and the financial stretch in our local authority. How can we be encouraging less inclusive schools to grasp inclusion? I thought that I would hand over to Debbie and Debs for perhaps one of you to pick up as we end this morning.
Okay, thanks. Shall I chip in there, Debs? Yeah, is that okay? I think, you know, if we're being completely honest with each other, that's, you know, we need to do this bit together. You know, some schools are slower to come than others. Some schools are right there and really want to grasp it. I suppose it's about us as systems leaders, you know, having honest discussions with each other. You know, Jo Ward's inclusion dashboard, I think, has really helped with this, because it shows, you know, in fairly stark terms, schools that maybe need some more support but might be a little bit reticent at coming forward, and there'll be all sorts of reasons for that. I'm hoping, because I believe deeply in kind of humanity and people being good, I'm hoping that people will see the power and not fear getting involved, you know, to see the power of getting involved. And I think we do that gradually, and crucially we do it together. You know, we've said that say the graduated response, that it's non-judgmental. Yes, we're going to have a look at what's happening and agree what's happening together, but we're absolutely not judging that. We're coming in to support and share best practice around it. And the more we can get that message out there, hopefully the more comfortable school leaders will be in, you know, in engaging with it. But things like the dashboard will help us do that, I hope.
Fantastic. Debs, do you have anything you want to add, or are you happy? You're happy. There's also a question that's just come in from Laura. How can we avoid bad practices in real life environments to ensure that staff are properly trained and up to date with SEND individuals and those elements? And I guess that is everything that we've been doing. The SEND peer review speaks to that directly.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree, Jerry, and I think Laura, you know, we know that everything isn't hunky-dory, but what we're hoping to do, certainly through the graduated response work, is, you know, we're coming into schools. If we can see common themes, I'll take quality first teaching because we've touched on it, everybody's touched on it so far. You know, we need to get that bit right in our schools, and we need to share best practice about that across our schools. So if when we're putting on training, we open it up more widely so that there are no barriers to the students, you know, the schools that want to engage, and the Senkos that can really see it's an issue, or the head teachers that can see it's an issue. Then we want to provide opportunity to actually get, you know, put some really some high quality CPD out there. you know, around autism, attachment, sensory, use of visuals, you know, all the sorts of things that we know are crucial to success, then, you know, it's our job, I think, as teaching schools and as strategic leaders to make sure that that training is as open as it can be to as many schools as possible.
Thank you so much, Debbie. I think that ends what has been a wonderful morning. Debbie, just while I have you here, I couldn't possibly let you go without taking this opportunity to say a much wider and bigger thank you to you on behalf of the OA SEND team for all your work over the past 4 years, and also, of course, to wish you a very happy retirement. Your leadership and guidance has shaped every inch of this project, from its inception right the way through to its conclusion, and we've just been hearing from you today about its ongoing legacy. You are a champion for inclusive education, and through your dedication to the opportunity area SEND team, you have reached positively into every school in Derby and influenced their practice. Through your vision and leadership of the OA, children in Derby would SEND are better supported and their outcomes improved. You have raised the profile of SEND and with SENCOs in the city, ensuring that head teachers, particularly in this, with the city's secondary sector, are aware of this project and committed to it. On a personal level, you've been a huge help to me, advising and guiding me to the smooth running of this project, and I can't thank you enough. So on behalf of the OA SEND team, I think Alistair is somewhere around in the background with a more tangible thank you.
That's very impressively cool today. Thank you. Thank you. Oh, well, that's very lovely. Thank you. Gosh, see what's possible through like virtual. We've got so good at virtual now, haven't we? Thank you, Jerry. That's very, very kind, and thanks everybody. I mean, for me, I just feel really, you know, very privileged to have been working with all of you, and I've learned so much myself along the journey, and that's what it's about, isn't it? For me, it's about learning with each other and together, and having those vulnerable children absolutely at the heart of everything we do, because like Andre said it this morning, if we're getting it right for them, we're getting it right for everybody. So you know, I'd like to return the thanks, Jerry, to you and to colleagues on the conference today, and you know, a wholehearted thanks for me for being allowed really to occupy this position, and with working with colleagues that I've learned so much from and have thoroughly enjoyed the journey. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Applause all from everybody. Thank you so much. Pip is applauding in the background here with me as well. Okay.